The noise was a controlled burn. A focused beam of high-G kinetic resonance played back at 40% volume. It was still enough to fracture bone in the inner ear. Nolan West braced his hands on the sterile cold steel table, fighting the urge to claw the sound straight out of his skull. 3 weeks had passed since the Kinthara engagement, yet the relentless, structural thrum of the apostrophe's stabilization ring still lived inside him, a parasitic frequency that ate sleep and spat out sweat. He tasted industrial fatigue, the cloying metallic grit of superheated actuator grease and plasma residue trapped in the recycled air of the interrogation room. Engineer West. The voice was synthesized, flat, and entirely devoid of echo, designed specifically to circumvent the residual acoustic dampening in his auditory implants. It was the voice of the Fleet Audit Tribunal, Section 7. Please confirm, for the record, the exact moment you initiated the emergency structural override on Habitat Ring 6. Nolan took a slow, agonizing breath, the sterile cold of the room failing to counteract the internal flush of panic. I confirmed the override at 0500 hours, Standard Terran, 21 days ago. And the protocol violation, Engineer? Protocol 6-Delta, subsection 3, Nolan recited, the words tasting like copper filings. Unauthorized destruction of designated cultural and biological containment unit, Ethan nomenclature, the Gardens of Xylos. A low, insistent hiss emanated from the speaker grid. It wasn't a fault, it was intentional. A low-grade sonic irritant designed to encourage compliance. This containment unit, the voice continued, its pace maddeningly slow, held the entire documented biological history of the Relith system's pre-space flight flora. The Ethan ambassador has filed a damages claim exceeding 300 billion credits. Commander Veris saved the station, Engineer West. But you, apparently, destroyed their heritage. Why? Nolan finally lifted his head, focusing his eyes on the one-way mirror where the unseen auditors sat, safe in their acoustically shielded bubble. He was 38 standard years old, but the kinetic trauma and lack of sleep had etched lines around his eyes that made him look 50. When Commander Veris deployed the stabilization infrastructure, Nolan explained, his voice rough, we were moving mass equivalent to a large terrestrial city. The kinetic energy transfer necessary to arrest Synthara's orbital decay put intolerable stress on the original habitat lattice. The Gardens of Xylos were situated directly adjacent to the anchor point for the No. 4 primary support pylon. They were elegant, certainly, built of shimmering crystalline compounds and designed to optimize light filtration. But they were structurally weak, unable to tolerate the vibration profile of a Type 9 dreadnought acting as a tow truck. He paused, a wave of nausea hitting him. Decay, not permanence. That was the Ethan philosophy, and he had violated it absolutely. Sir, the gardens were not listed as critical infrastructure. They were aesthetic. If I had paused for the diplomatic 24-hour notification period required by Protocol 6-Delta, the resulting shear force would have ripped Ring 6 entirely off the habitat, venting 40,000 Ethan into vacuum. I chose 40,000 lives, over 300 billion credits worth of historical moss. A silence followed, heavy and charged with the paranoia electric hum of the room's air filtration. The tribunal was not interested in lives saved. They were interested in the political fallout and the financial liability. Your choice is noted, engineer, but the failure to adhere to the process of notification casts a shadow on the mission's overall success. Commander Veris followed protocol, ensuring the primary life support stabilization was managed. You acted unilaterally, generating a legal disaster that threatens the entire Sector 7 Treaty Alliance. Nolan clenched his jaw. Veris had followed protocol by delivering a massive, terrifying solution, then left the cleanup, the moral and political reckoning, to the junior officers on the ground. The dreadnought doctrine: solve the problem with overwhelming force and let the bureaucracy deal with the collateral damage. I executed necessary damage control, Nolan stated, pushing the words past the tightness in his throat. The Ethan system is safe, and if their culture is so fragile that the noise of our rescue destroyed it, perhaps that fragility was the real flaw in their design. The tribunal let that statement hang in the air. A deliberate strategic pause. Your resignation from the Logistics Corps is accepted, Engineer West. The voice finally stated. Effective immediately. Your actions, while achieving the primary objective of survival, demonstrated a disregard for interspecies relations and resource management. You will be held financially responsible for a fractional percentage of the damages, amounting to 3 million credits. 3 million, a debt that would shackle him for decades in the outer colonies, paying interest on a decision that saved thousands of lives. This was the cost of efficiency. The institutional knife twisted into the back of the individual soldier who had to choose the ugly, necessary truth over the elegant, politically correct lie. The screen flickered, replacing the Audit Section's logo with the harsh, angular sigil of the newly formed Terran Strategic Defense Initiative, TSDI. A new, much deeper, heavily modulated voice replaced the tribunal drone. This voice was not synthesized. It was deep and gravelly, carrying the distinct texture of a highly decorated officer who rarely needed to raise his tone. Nolan West, we read your file, specifically the part about the structural tolerance decision. Nolan straightened up, instantly recognizing the cadence of command. Sir. TSDI doesn't care about Moss or 300 billion credits, West. We care about hard choices made under kinetic duress. We care about men who can prioritize mass integrity over cultural preservation. You broke one rule, but you upheld the foundational rule: survival at all costs. The screen shifted again, showing not a person, but a complex high-resolution orbital map. The Relith system was a tiny, inconsequential pinprick on the edge of the display. The map was dominated by a dark, rapidly expanding cloud of red telemetry data. A massive, unexplored zone, 20 parsecs deep, known only as the Veil. The Ethan called us Deathworlders because we build solutions that last forever. Unfortunately, that kind of resilience is about to be tested by something that doesn't just fear our noise, West. It fears our existence. We have intercepted an active military broadcast from within the Veil. It's not a distress call. It's an advance warning. The voice lowered, now conspiratorial, a deep thrumming that felt far more menacing than the kinetic resonator had. We need men who have already sacrificed their ethics for mass stability. We need men who know how to choose ugly survival. Your debt is wiped clean. Your resignation is rescinded. You have a new posting, effective 0600. You will report to the deep space carrier, the Sword of Orion, for immediate deployment. Nolan felt a sharp, desperate cold settle in his chest. He was being offered redemption not through healing, but through deeper service to the very destructive philosophy that had broken him. The officer's voice concluded, "The threat designation is Scarveth. They operate on a scale that will make Commander Varys's Synthara fix look like trimming a lawn with safety scissors. Engineer West, we are not going to save this civilization quietly. Are you prepared to be loud?" Nolan looked down at his trembling hands, feeling the phantom vibration of the kinetic resonators in his bones. He could feel the systemic failure of the human galaxy, a bureaucratic system that punished efficiency and demanded liability, forcing him into a catastrophic conflict against a species that dwarfed their dreadnoughts. "Sir," Nolan whispered, the sound thick with defeat and residual pain, "I am prepared." The map on the screen zoomed in on the veil. Amidst the red smear of interference, a single enormous signature pulsed, an energy reading beyond any known Terran classification. The raw power indicated a logistical nightmare so profound it made Synthara seem like a sandbox incident. This time, they weren't sending a relief platform that looked like a dreadnought. They were sending a dreadnought, and he was going with it. Nolan stood alone, the high-frequency hum of the room now a promise of inevitable deafening war. The promise of war did not taste like triumph. It tasted like ozone and the metallic residue of fear. Nolan's whisper, "I am prepared," was not a declaration of readiness, but the exhausted acceptance of a condemned man. He did not move for a long moment, simply absorbing the systemic shift, the sudden, violent retraction of the institutional debt that had suffocated him moments before. The bureaucracy, which had demanded 3 million credits for the sake of political optics, now offered a full pardon for the price of his soul. The screen displaying the TSDI, sigil dimmed, leaving the interrogation room in a sickly, pulsating amber light. Nolan finally pushed himself away from the cold table. His legs felt alien, stiffened by the 3 weeks of psychological pressure and the 3 minutes of rapid-fire legal and military whiplash. He stumbled out into the dimly lit corridor of the Apostrophe's administrative sector. The air here was heavy, recycled hundreds of times, carrying the faint, persistent odor of old synthetics and mildew, the smell of a system that only functions through constant artificial maintenance. This sector was designed for quiet, cold efficiency, but even here, the low-frequency thrum of the massive, over-engineered ship was present, a physical manifestation of human tenacity. Nolan's new orders were already pushed to his datapad. Report to Bay C9. Immediate transfer via jump shuttle to TSDI carrier the Sword of Orion. Clearance Gamma 3. Gamma 3. That level of clearance meant he was no longer an engineer. He was an asset, a tool prioritized above mere political liabilities. As he walked, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the hollow corridor, he passed a small, recessed waste disposal unit. He automatically reached out, his hand twitching, ready to activate the unit, to clean up the invisible dirt. It was a reflex ingrained from years of ensuring that the massive human systems never failed, that the structural integrity was absolute, that the chaos of the outside world was kept at bay by meticulous maintenance. He hated the filth, the moral and physical grime that always clung to the edges of massive operations. He remembered Synthara, not the falling station, but the small detail that had haunted his sleep. The crushed, crystallized remains of the gardens of Xylos. Beautiful and fragile, pulverized not by the enemy, but by the sheer unyielding force of human salvation. It had glittered like shattered dreams under the harsh light of the kinetic stabilizers. Aesthetics versus necessity. The tribunal judged the aesthetics. The TSDI judged the necessity. A figure stepped out of a side office, blocking his path. She wore the sharp obsidian uniform of the Strategic Policy Corps, her posture rigid, a data slate held tightly in hands that looked too delicate for the command position she clearly held. This was Meryn Frost. Her eyes, the colour of frozen glacier water, assessed him with clinical disinterest, cataloguing his exhaustion and his residual tremor. Engineer West, or should I say, Strategist West, Gamma 3, she stated, her voice precise, every syllable weighted with institutional authority. I am Chief Policy Analyst Frost. I'm your escort. Nolan managed a curt nod. Analyst. I read the transcript of your audit tribunal. A messy affair. 40,000 lives saved, 300 billion credits lost, and a cultural atrocity committed. A typical human solution. Nolan felt a sharp, internal spike of defensiveness, but kept his voice flat. I prioritized the mass integrity analyst. The structural matrix was failing. Frost didn't flinch. I understand kinetic stress, West. I understand the geometry of failure. What I fail to understand is why you did not utilize the emergency kinetic buffer field before. Initiating the physical override. That would have provided sufficient structural stability for a 20-minute window, allowing for diplomatic notification and avoiding the violation of Protocol 6 Delta. Nolan stared at her, the blood draining from his face. The kinetic buffer field. He hadn't thought of it. In the panic of the moment, with the structural integrity report screaming red alerts and the internal pressure gauge dropping exponentially, he had reverted to the most brutal, direct solution. Physical force. The buffer field drains 30% of main reactor output, Nolan ground out, suddenly feeling the weight of his failure far more than the 3 million credit debt. If I had diverted that power, we risked a brownout in the temporary life support systems we had just established on Ring 2. A risk, West, but not a certainty, Frost countered, her tone cutting and academic. Your decision was not based on absolute impossibility, but on minimizing your own risk of cascading failure. You chose the most brute force, least administratively complex solution. The result was structural preservation at the cost of political stability. The Scarveth will exploit this incident for decades in their propaganda. They will paint us as the wreckers, the destroyers of art and life. Nolan felt the pressure return. Not the hum of a resonator, but the cold, hard force of bureaucratic logic crushing his rationale. He had focused so intensely on saving the 40,000 Ethin that he had forgotten the larger, more insidious enemy. The systemic failure of interspecies trust, the delicate fabric of political necessity. So, the TSDI hires me because I saved lives, then faults me because I created bad press? Nolan asked, a bitter edge in his voice. Frost's expression hardened. The TSDI recognizes that in a true war, political stability is a secondary luxury. But we also require professionals who understand the scale of the conflict. The Scarveth are not diplomatic adversaries, West. They are an ontological threat. They view organic life as a resource to be harvested, not a civilization to be negotiated with. Their logistical signature, which you saw on the map, is indicative of a fleet size 3 orders of magnitude larger than anything the Terran sphere currently maintains. She leaned in, lowering her voice, finally breaking the professional veneer to inject a sliver of genuine, terrifying information. When we say the Sword of Orion is a dreadnought, we mean it. It is our final card. It carries a crew of 60,000, a projected armament capacity equivalent to 2 full sector fleets, and its armor plating is rated to survive a focused gamma-ray burst. Frost straightened up, the mask of ice returning. But even that, West, is a solution, not a preventative measure. We need men who understand that the moment of failure is the most critical point. The Scarveth will not send a diagnostic query. They will send a mass extinction event. And we need you to look at that failing system, that moment of total chaos, and choose the ugliest, most efficient path to survival, irrespective of the collateral damage. She tapped his data pad, activating the transit route. The jump shuttle is waiting. Get on board, engineer. You need to sleep. We have 24 hours before we reach the Orion, and you will spend the entire jump cycle reviewing the Scarveth's known tactical doctrine. It details their preference for attacking critical infrastructure, systems that sustain life, not military targets. Nolan started walking again, the weight of the Orion's eventual deployment settling on his shoulders. He thought of his childhood, a flicker of memory from the Mars reclamation wars. His father, an infrastructure technician, sealing bulkheads while the colony outside buckled under orbital bombardment. Integrity, boy. That's all that matters. Not who's right, but what holds. The system had punished him for his father's ethic, but now the deeper, darker system, the TSDI, was rewarding it. They didn't want a hero. They wanted a technician who was willing to commit necessary atrocities. He reached Bay C9. The transport shuttle was a small, brutally armoured craft, painted a dull, non-reflective grey. It was not built for comfort or speed, but for surviving atmospheric entry into hell. As Nolan stepped onto the boarding ramp, Frost's voice returned, amplified slightly through her comm unit. A cold, final instruction. One more thing, West. Your specific posting on the Orion will be the primary fusion reactor core. We don't need you engineering kinetic solutions to orbital decay. We need you to ensure that the source of our power, the heart of the dreadnought, cannot be disabled. Your task is structural integrity, absolute and without compromise. If the core takes a hit, you will be the one authorizing the emergency stabilization shunt. Nolan stopped halfway up the ramp, turning back to look at Frost. And what is the consequence of activating that shunt, analyst? Frost's eyes were emotionless, reflecting only the harsh bay lights. The shunt will stabilize the core by forcing a 5-second kinetic overload through the tertiary heat exchangers. It will save the ship, West, but those exchangers run directly beneath the bridge, the medical bay, and the crew quarters of Sector 7. It will sterilize 100 square meters of life support systems, instantly killing everyone in those zones. She offered the final ugly truth with the detached neutrality of a policy briefing. We have calculated the statistical probability, West. The shunt saves 60,000 lives at the cost of 2,384 crew members. Your decision, when the time comes, will be instantaneous. Will you break the few to save the many, engineer? Or will you risk total annihilation for the sake of ethical purity? The shuttle door began to cycle shut, the thick polysteel closing off the sterile light of the apostrophe. Nolan was sealed inside, plunged into the deep, echoing static of the transit vessel. He was no longer running from the 3 million credit debt. He was running toward a debt payable only in human lives, held solely by his hand. He gripped the nearest rail, the metal vibrating with the anticipation of the jump drive ignition. He tasted the recycled air, now sharp with the scent of fear and absolute unavoidable choices. The noise was gone, replaced by the crushing silence of predestination. He knew with absolute certainty that when the Scarveth arrived, he would be loud. The crushing silence of predestination lasted precisely until the jump drive engaged, which filled the small transport with a high-pitched, systemic shriek that felt less like propulsion and more like a physical violation of the tympanic membrane. The vibration was intense, a low-grade kinetic battering that rattled Nolan's teeth and blurred his vision. He spent the 24-hour transit cycle immersed in the Scarveth doctrine, a digital abyss of tactical data and xenological horror. He did not sleep. The environment inside the shuttle shifted from cold neutrality to the heavy oil-saturated heat of high-stress machinery. He smelled the burnt insulation of the secondary regulators struggling under the persistent strain of the jump, and beneath that, the coppery scent of his own sweat mixed with the thick, metallic odour of industrial grease, the atmospheric signature of a war machine operating at 70% beyond its rated capacity. The Scarveth were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were systemic predators. Their primary tactical goal was not ship-to-ship destruction, but the disruption of logistics and life support. They attacked the soft places, the water recyclers, the atmospheric scrubbers, the internal gravity generators. When the shuttle finally docked with the Sword of Orion, the transition was not seamless. It was a brutal physical shock, a shudder that ran the length of the dreadnought's 7-kilometer spine. Nolan was immediately routed through 4 security checks and 3 decontamination chambers. The interior of the Orion was stark, massive, and overwhelmingly functional. There were no decorative accents, no attempts at comfort. Everything was reinforced polysteel and bundled conduit, painted institutional grey. This ship was not built to host, it was built to endure. His posting, the primary fusion reactor core, was deep within the central structure, shielded by dozens of meters of high-density composite armor. It was hot here, radiating a deep, persistent dry heat that stole the moisture from his lungs. The air tasted perpetually of charged particles and hydraulic fluid. "Engineer West," the voice crackled over the intercom, flat and professional. "This is Commander Sorel. Welcome to the Corps. Your team is waiting." Nolan found the 4 engineers, all veterans, hardened by logistical crises on the periphery, in the main control bunker, a narrow, blast-reinforced cylinder overlooking the glowing heart of the dreadnought. The core pulsed with contained chaotic power, a contained star fueling 60,000 lives and enough weaponry to shatter a planetary moon. "We're running hot, West," said the senior engineer, a woman named Vega, her face streaked with soot despite the clean environment. "The jump drive demanded too much. The magnetic confinement fields are fluctuating at 97.5%. "Stabilization plan?" Nolan asked, immediately reverting to his mechanical autopilot. "We're cycling the cryogenic moderators, but it's too slow. The temperature is spiking in reactor ring 3. We need a faster solution to drop the core output by 3% in the next 2 cycles, or we risk a cascade failure of the heat exchangers." Nolan accessed the core diagnostics on his console. The data screamed the truth. The crisis was imminent, and it was entirely internal. The Scarveth hadn't even arrived, and the human machinery was already failing under its own immense strain. "We hate doing things twice," Varys had said. They built redundancy, but they also built systems so vast and powerful that their self-correction was a terrifying proposition. "Cycle the emergency boron rods in sequence Alpha 1 to Alpha 3, Nolan ordered, his voice clipped and decisive. "Initiate a controlled, momentary micro-surge in the primary confinement coils to redistribute the magnetic field, then immediately dump 10,000 litres of coolant through the secondary injectors. We buy ourselves 15 minutes to bring the moderators back online." Vega hesitated. "West, that surge will spike the radiation shielding on the outer hull layers, momentarily blinding our early warning systems in Sector 4. "It's a risk we take," Nolan countered, ignoring the political consequence of temporary blindness. "We stabilize the core now, or we all vaporize. Execute." The engineers moved. The console lights flickered with alarming intensity. For 6 tense seconds, the Orion held its breath. Nolan felt the change physically. A deep, resonant whine from the reactor shifting the magnetic fields. The heat exchangers groaned, and then, slowly, agonizingly, the numbers dropped. 96%, 95%. Stable. "Core integrity nominal," Vega reported, breathing heavily. "Good work," Nolan said, wiping the sweat from his eyes. He had fixed the immediate technical problem. Proving his value to the TSDI, he had also, unknowingly, created a systemic vulnerability. Commander Sorel's voice returned, strained and urgent. "West, we have incoming, not a ship. A sustained wide-spectrum electromagnetic pulse. It's localized on Sector 4. We're blind on 3 tactical arrays." Nolan slammed his fist on the console. "The Scarveth are here. They exploited the temporary radiation spike caused by our stabilization routine. They knew we'd prioritize the core. They hit the system that sustains our ability to see them." "Tactical assessment," Sorel demanded. "They are using the EMP to cover an approach. They are targeting a critical infrastructural weak point. Find me the nearest soft target to Sector 4. Vega pulled up the ship schematics. Sector 4 houses the primary atmospheric recycling manifold for crew quarters Sector 7, the ones under the heat exchangers. Nolan felt a spike of icy dread. The place Merrin Frost had mentioned. The future kill zone. Suddenly, the floor beneath their feet lurched violently. It was not the smooth acceleration of a jump drive, but a ragged, tearing impact, a localized kinetic breach. Alarms blared, red lights strobing through the heat-hazed bunker. "We've been boarded!" Vega shouted. "Multiple small craft breaching outer plating. They're not attacking military sections. They're moving directly for the A7 manifold." Nolan knew the Scarveth wouldn't send large boarding parties. They would send small, specialized units designed to chemically or biologically contaminate the life support systems, turning the Orion into a floating tomb. "Sorel, divert security to the A7 manifold. The structural integrity of the ship hinges on clean air, not firepower," Nolan yelled into the comms. But the Scarveth had already moved beyond simple contamination. "West!" Vega cried, pointing at the reactor diagnostics. "The tertiary heat exchanger conduits. They're failing. Not from core pressure. External damage. The Scarveth didn't breach the manifold. They breached the heat exchanger conduit that runs parallel to it. They're using the heat, the sheer output of our core, against us." Nolan looked at the screen. The temperature gauge for the exchanger lines, the lines running beneath the bridge in Sector 7, was climbing exponentially. The breach was releasing superheated plasma vapor directly into the conduit network. It was an elegant, terrifyingly efficient solution. If that vapor reached the life support grid, the crew in Sector 7 would boil alive instantly. "We have approximately 1 minute before the vapor reaches critical mass," Nolan stated, his voice devoid of emotion, the engineer taking over from the man. "We need to purge the line." Vega shook her head frantically. "The purge mechanism is designed for coolant, not superheated plasma. If we hit the purge, the back pressure will rupture the core's internal magnetic shielding. Then we use the stabilization shunt," Nolan declared, moving toward the activation console. Vega grabbed his arm. "No! West! Frost's calculation! That shunt kills 2,384 people instantly. We only have 600 people in Sector 7 right now." Nolan hesitated, the horror of the choice tearing through the technical veneer of his mind. He was being forced to make the ugly arithmetic choice, the precise moment of failure Frost had described. Kill 2,300 to save 600 people, plus the 60,000 still reliant on the core's stability. The calculus was brutal, absolute, and demanded immediate execution. "The Scarveth know the shunt calculation, Vega," Nolan whispered, realizing the depth of the trap. "If we allow the plasma to breach, the entire core will destabilize and 60,000 people die. They are forcing us to kill our own crew to save the ship. This is their psychological warfare." Nolan threw off Vega's hand and reached for the shunt activation panel. He had to hit the system hard, with brutal certainty. He had to be loud. "Divert all power to shunt activation. Prepare for 5 seconds of kinetic overload," Nolan commanded, his fingers hovering over the single red guarded button. Suddenly, a massive power spike hit the core bunker. The lights went out completely, plunging the chamber into utter blackness, broken only by the angry red strobes of the emergency system. The console went dead. "EMP! A secondary focused pulse!" Vega gasped, the sound muffled by the darkness. Nolan felt a paralyzing wave of defeat. The Scarveth had anticipated the shunt. They hadn't wanted him to hesitate. They wanted him to commit, then denied him the ability to act, forcing the worst possible outcome. "Status!" Nolan roared into the darkness. "External power completely cut. Auxiliary batteries running at 30%. Vega's voice crackled. "The heat is rising. The plasma is moving past the containment field. We have 40 seconds to catastrophic failure." The core bunker began to heat up rapidly, the thick metallic air now oven-hot. Nolan clawed his way to the emergency manual override, a simple lever that required brute physical force to engage. "The manual override!" Nolan shouted, finding the lever. "It bypasses the electronic safety. It's kinetic. It might buy us 10 seconds, but it will shatter my arm when I throw it." "You have to take the hit, West," Vega yelled. "It's the only way to slow the flow." Nolan braced himself, gripping the thick, cold steel lever. He closed his eyes, remembering the image of the shattered, crystallized gardens of the Ethan, the aesthetic sacrifice he had made for structural integrity. With a grunt of pure desperation, he slammed the lever forward with all the force he possessed. A searing pain, like bone tearing and muscle exploding, shot up his arm, followed by the blinding flash of raw electrical discharge and kinetic feedback. The sound was a raw, splitting crack, followed by a terrible, sustained metallic groan from the core structure. He collapsed, his left arm hanging uselessly, broken and smoking. But the temperature gauge, now visible on a sputtering emergency display, dropped by 0.5 degrees. Not enough. "It bought us 5 seconds, West," Vega said, kneeling beside him, her face illuminated by the flickering red strobes. "They're still inside. They're moving deeper, and we have lost atmospheric filtration on 3 levels. A new alert flashed, stark white against the blood-red background. It wasn't a tactical alert. It was a communication, TSDI, command to the Sword of Orion. Veil breach confirmed. The enemy is not the Scarveth boarding party. They are a diversion. We are tracking a mass energy signature moving toward Terrasphere. It is using the Scarveth's internal logistical signature as a cloaking field." Nolan looked at the single line of text, the information striking him with more force than the broken lever. The Scarveth were not the enemy. They were the bait. "Vega," Nolan whispered, tasting blood and burnt insulation. "We just broke our arm to fight a swarm of gnats, and the actual predator is already at the perimeter." The low, heavy shudder of the Orion returned, this time deeper, more resonant. The sound of an impossibly large force tearing the very fabric of space nearby. The energy reading on the emergency display spiked violently, pushing far past the theoretical maximums of the scale. It was not a ship. It was a moving fortress. A colossal structure that defied terrestrial geometry, filling the viewport of the distant bridge cameras. A shape that ate light. Vega helped him to his feet, ignoring his broken arm. The heat in the bunker was now unbearable, choking and dry. They were alive, but utterly isolated, deep within the heart of a system that was hemorrhaging power and integrity. "What is that, West?" Vega asked, her voice cracking with pure primal fear. Nolan looked at the massive, encroaching shadow on the screen, feeling the systemic failure not just of the dreadnought, but of humanity's preparedness. He had traded 3 million credits for the certainty of this moment. The moment when the necessary brutality of human survival was tested against a threat that mocked their scale. "That," Nolan rasped, leaning heavily on the console, the pain in his arm a dull, secondary concern, "is why we call ourselves Deathworlders. Because we are about to find out exactly how much physical force is required to break something that massive." The massive structure loomed closer, silent, overwhelming, and utterly uncaring of the small, loud, flawed humans trapped within their dreadnought. The blinding flash of the manual override's electrical feedback receded, leaving the core bunker in deep, pulsing red. The air, thick with the smell of plasma vapor and superheated metal, felt less like an environment and more like a physical chokehold. Nolan didn't focus on the pain, a fire that ran from his wrist to his shoulder, but on the sheer terrifying magnitude of the approaching entity, which was using the chaos of the Scarveth raid as its curtain. Vega, her face smeared with soot and worry, managed to splint his left arm with high-density composite rods salvaged from a nearby console, the makeshift bandage rigid and unforgiving. "We need to get out of this heat, West. The auxiliary cooling is offline. We are 2 degrees away from an internal hull warp." Nolan pushed himself away from the console, leaning on his good arm. "No medbay. The A7 medbay is where the plasma vapor will hit first if the containment fails. We go to the data maintenance sector. It runs parallel to the abandoned Sector 7 crew quarters." The data maintenance sector, he knew, was usually kept at cryogenic temperatures to preserve the historical mission logs, an institutional graveyard of paper trails and strategic failures. It was the antithesis of the core bunker's searing heat, offering temporary refuge and, more importantly, access to restricted files. The journey was a brutal stagger through darkened, hemorrhaging corridors. The Orion was groaning now, the sound not of structural integrity, but of slow, mechanical agony. The automated emergency systems had prioritized firefighting efforts near the initial breach, leaving the internal passages silent and cold. The air, as they descended through 3 access levels, grew stale, smelling sharply of uncirculated air and synthetic decay. The odor of a system that had failed and was slowly going dormant. They reached the data maintenance sector, a narrow chamber walled with thick, moisture-beading ferroconcrete. Nolan used his Gamma-3 clearance and his one functional arm to pry open the heavy, insulated door. The atmosphere inside hit them like a physical wall, a dry, biting cold that immediately started to pull the residual heat from their bodies. The air was sterile, carrying the sharp, chemical tang of ozone and high-grade archival refrigerants. Vega immediately started checking the power conduits, shivering. The Scarveth EMP must have cut the sector's primary power. The auxiliary cooling tanks are running full cold. We have maybe 20 minutes before we start getting hypothermia. Nolan ignored her, moving directly to the central data nexus, a cluster of outdated but heavily shielded terminals designed to survive anything short of a direct core breach. He slammed his datapad into the primary archive slot, bypassing 3 layers of security protocols using the override code given to him by the TSDI. "I need to know what that object is," Nolan muttered, his breath clouding in the sub-zero air. "It is too massive, too slow. It doesn't match any known Scarveth or hostile profile." He plunged into the archival data, searching through the Orion's pre-deployment logs, the deep infrastructure reports that Merrin Frost would have filed before they left port. He wasn't looking for the enemy's identity. He was looking for the TSDI's intent. The data scrolled across the terminal screen in blinding white text. The Scarveth profile was there, precisely as they had encountered it. Preference for infrastructural attack, specialized EMP charges, the targeted breach of the heat exchanger conduits. It was all planned. Too planned. Then Nolan found it, nested deep within a classified 27-dimensional structural survey report labeled Project Chimera. The massive object approaching the Sword of Orion was not a warship. It was a centuries-old, derelict Class 11 interstellar habitation ark, designated the Pilgrim's Cradle. It was vast, slow, powered by ancient low-yield drives and entirely non-militarized. It was essentially a colossal, slow-moving habitat filled with 10,000 hibernating civilians from a pre-galactic alliance species, a non-aligned, non-threatening cargo of potential refugees. Nolan's blood ran cold, far colder than the refrigerated air. The Scarveth were not providing a cloaking field for a hostile dreadnought. They were diverting attention from the Ark. Why? He scrolled further, his broken hand throbbing in rhythm with the data surge. The Cradle was currently transiting the Veil, an officially uncharted, politically volatile sector. The TSDI knew this Ark was carrying pre-contact biological and cultural data that could destabilize dozens of current political treaties. More critically, the Ark carried enough fissile material in its ancient, unmonitored core to create a strategic nuclear yield equivalent to 50,000 Terran warheads. The truth: the TSDI had not sent the Sword of Orion to defend the sector. They had sent it to eliminate the Pilgrim's Cradle, to sterilize the 10,000 civilians and seize or destroy the core, thus preventing a political and military nightmare of unknown scale from entering Terran space. The Scarveth, the nuisance enemy, were merely the perfect excuse for overwhelming force. Merrin Frost's cold calculation, the 2,384 dead crew members from the stabilization shunt, suddenly gained a horrifying clarity. The TSDI needed the Orion to look desperately crippled, isolated and overwhelmed by a phantom enemy. Only then could they justify the use of their most devastating, politically impossible weapon. The one that would require maximum kinetic overload. The kind of overload that would vaporize the Ark with extreme collateral damage. A decision only a broken, isolated commander would make. "West, what is it?" Vega demanded, hovering over him, clutching her arms against the cold. Nolan slowly looked up, his face pale and drawn. "The enemy isn't the Scarveth. The Scarveth are the cover story. The thing approaching is a ghost ship filled with civilians, carrying a core that the TSDI considers a strategic time bomb. We were sent here to execute a scorched earth operation and frame the Scarveth for it." Vega stared, horror spreading across her face. A false flag? On this scale? "We are the instrument of political atrocity, Vega. The shunt wasn't designed to save the ship from the Scarveth. It was designed to be the emergency override for the ship's primary weapon system, a focused kinetic torpedo, allowing the TSDI to hit the Ark while simultaneously eliminating the bridge crew that might object." He pointed at the diagnostic data on the screen. The Scarveth boarding craft, having completed their diversion, were retreating, but not back the way they came. They were heading toward the Orion's external communications array. The Scarveth know the TSDI plan, Nolan realized, the bitter truth settling in his bones. They attacked us to force us to rely on brute force solutions, crippling our ability to communicate or maneuver effectively. But now they are making sure we stay blind. If they disable the main communications array, we are politically isolated and completely at the mercy of the TSDI's command structure. They force the choice onto Commander Sorrell: vaporize 10,000 civilians or risk the TSDI falling apart. The decision was no longer between 2,000 lives and 60,000. It was between systemic betrayal and absolute professional condemnation. If he restores communications, he exposes the TSDI and risks total civil war among the Terran fleet. If he fails, 10,000 non-combatants and his own ship are incinerated for political expediency. "Vega, we have to restore external comms," Nolan said, his voice flat, resolute. "We breach protocol again. We choose the largest, most painful political consequence over the immediate physical necessity. We stop the TSDI before they can use us as their butcher's knife. How, West? The EMP fried the primary relay. Auxiliary power is almost gone, and we are miles from the comm tower. Nolan pointed to the massive, shielded conduits running along the ceiling of the data maintenance sector. This sector's sole purpose is redundancy. There is a tertiary comlink booster built into the archival storage grid. It's antiquated, it's low bandwidth, and it's never been stress-tested. But it bypasses the main relays. It requires an immediate total power surge from the auxiliary batteries, our last 15%. Vega understood the implication. If we drain the batteries completely, we lose all emergency life support until the core is manually restored. If the plasma breach escalates, we die instantly because we have no power to run the remaining internal purifiers. Nolan nodded. Aesthetic purity versus necessary structural integrity. I chose the latter on Synthara. Now, I choose the impossible path of political integrity, even if it kills us. I cannot be the technician who greenlights the slaughter of 10,000 innocents for institutional peace. He moved to the terminal, his broken arm screaming with every micro-movement, and began routing the power transfer. He keyed in the command sequence, redirect auxiliary power, vector Alpha 79, initiate tertiary broadcast shunt. "Do it, West!" Vega yelled, bracing herself against the cold wall. Nolan slammed the final command key. A violent surge of energy ripped through the data maintenance sector. The archival lighting flared a brilliant, painful white, momentarily vaporizing the moisture in the air. The internal temperature gauges dropped catastrophically as the remaining battery power was sucked dry. For 3 seconds, the terminal displayed a single triumphant message. External comlink restored. Low bandwidth. Nolan quickly typed a high-priority coded message to the nearest Terran sector fleet. Delta 5. Urgent. Orion comlink. Scarveth false flag. Imminent political fire. Incoming object is unarmed habitat arc. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Before he could send the final confirmation, the terminal shorted out, plunging the sector into absolute deafening darkness. The power was gone. Then, a new sound cutting through the silence, a high-pitched metallic shriek. Not from the Orion's machinery, but from the hull itself. The residual Scarveth boarding party, realizing their cover was blown by the brief flicker of comms, had detonated their retreat charge, not near the comms array, but deep within the structural bulkheads adjacent to the data maintenance sector. The explosion wasn't kinetic. It was precisely calculated structural resonance. A terrible tearing sound followed as the massive ferro-concrete wall separating the data maintenance sector from the abandoned Sector 7 crew quarters buckled inward. The impact fractured the internal containment of the cryogenic coolant tanks. A massive, suffocating wave of super-chilled, highly concentrated liquid nitrogen exploded into the chamber. Nolan gasped, the ultra-cold air stealing the breath from his lungs instantly. He felt the cold begin to crystallize his exposed skin. He could hear Vega coughing, stumbling blindly in the freezing darkness. The decision to restore communications had bought political honesty for a fraction of a second, and the price was physical annihilation. From the darkness, Commander Sorel's voice, now a thin, frantic whisper on a failing internal battery circuit, crackled. "West! The external signature! It's gone! The massive object! It just vanished! We didn't fire, but it's gone!" Nolan, fighting the paralysis of the freezing cold, realized the chilling final truth. The Pilgrim's cradle hadn't vanished. The massive energy signature that had provided the Scarveth's initial cloak had reacted to Nolan's brief, panicked transmission. The Ark, powered by ancient defensive technology unknown to the TSDI, had activated its own deep-spectrum cloaking field and fled. He had saved the 10,000 civilians, but he had done it by draining the last of the Orion's energy and exposing the dreadnought to the real enemy, the institutional power that now viewed him as a direct threat. The deep, heavy shudder that followed was not the Ark retreating, but the sound of the TSDI sector fleet, alerted by Nolan's coded warning, engaging the now fully visible and retreating Scarveth ships. A desperate, chaotic engagement now fully broadcast across the sector. Nolan collapsed against the freezing floor, the liquid nitrogen vapor swirling around him. He felt the chilling, inescapable truth of his failure. He had created the civil war he was trying to prevent, and he was now trapped, frozen and crippled, deep inside the paralyzed war machine he had betrayed. The ultimate cost of structural integrity was not just blood, but absolute isolation. The liquid nitrogen explosion bought Nolan political honesty for a fraction of a second, and the subsequent structural collapse cost him his breath. He lay on the freezing deck plating, his entire body locked in a rime of cryo-vapor, the pain from his broken arm now a deep, agonizing ache overshadowed by the paralyzing cold. When consciousness returned, it was not with a rush of warmth, but with the crushing systemic weight of the Orion's ongoing failure. The lights were dead. The data maintenance sector was a silent tomb, the air stale and sharp with uncirculated ozone. The liquid nitrogen had evaporated, leaving behind a sterile layer of frozen dust and a pervasive, aching cold that promised hypothermia within minutes. He tried to sit up, a grunt of effort escaping his lips. His splintered left arm was rigid, useless, a heavy, cold anchor attached to a body that felt impossibly vast and exhausted. Nolan looked for Vega. She lay 5 meters away, near the shattered breach in the ferro-concrete wall. The cold had been instantaneous, absolute. Vega was perfectly preserved, a statue sculpted from ice and composite fiber. Her face was calm, reflecting not fear, but the deep, terminal exhaustion of a technician who had worked herself to death to save a failing machine. She had died for a 3-second transmission. Political integrity. The phrase tasted like ash and ice. Nolan had sacrificed his friend, the dreadnought's last auxiliary power, and his own physical integrity to save 10,000 non-combatants who had immediately cloaked and fled, leaving the sword of Orion paralyzed and exposed. He listened. The external battle was fading, a distant muffled roar of kinetic fire and plasma discharge. The TSDI sector fleet engaging the retreating Scarveth. The immediate physical danger had passed, replaced by the profound existential threat of institutional retribution. He was isolated, trapped, crippled. He had no power, no allies, and Commander Sorel's last communication indicated he was now politically radioactive. The man who had actively sabotaged the TSDI's classified strategic objective. He was not a prisoner of war. He was a liability, scheduled for silent internal execution. Nolan crawled towards the shattered wall, the friction of his movements against the cold plating. A physical drag that demanded obscene effort. He felt the fatigue of the last 4 weeks, the kinetic battering of Synthara, the relentless pressure of the tribunal, the white-hot terror of the core breach, and now the crushing cold. His body was a monument to industrial exhaustion, every nerve screaming failure. He reached the gaping, fractured hole the Scarveth structural resonance charge had created. It was an ugly wound, jagged edges of polysteel and fractured concrete that had separated the data sector from the abandoned crew quarters of Sector 7. He rested his head against the cold concrete, feeling the low-frequency thrum of the dreadnought's primary systems, the sound of 60,000 lives continuing despite his failures. Why did you do it, West? The question wasn't Merrin Frost's cold judgment. It was his own, delivered with brutal honesty. He hadn't chosen to save the 10,000 civilians out of pure altruism. He had made the decision because he was terrified of becoming the man who pulled the trigger for the state. He was afraid of carrying Merrin Frost's arithmetic of atrocity. He chose the risk of systemic failure over the certainty of personal guilt. He was a coward who traded direct guilt for indirect political chaos. He had chosen the ugly, impossible path simply because the easy, brutal path was too final for his soul. You broke the system, not because you were a hero, but because you were weak. He realized that the Scarveth, in their attempt to silence the Orion, had created the perfect trap for him. If he stayed, he froze or was captured. If he tried to move, he would likely collapse and die. He was administratively dead and physically decaying. The thrum shifted, subtly. It was no longer the steady hum of endurance, but a high-pitched, insistent vibration, the signature of internal security patrols moving through the bulkheads. They were coming for him. Nolan pushed his gaze through the darkness, forcing his exhausted mind back to the technical reality. He studied the fractured edge of the bulkhead. The Scarveth resonance charge had been localized. A precise tear, not a general explosion. They had relied on the freezing cold and the collapse to kill the technicians. But the tear, centered precisely on the dividing wall, had inadvertently exposed an ancient, forgotten logistical feature. The abandoned Sector 7 crew quarters were designated Zone 0, a quarantine area from the Orion's initial virus-related failures 2 centuries ago. Everything in Zone 0 was sealed, but protocols demanded that even dead zones must have an independent manual access point for historical review. A barely visible sealed maintenance duct, sized for emergency passage, ran along the ceiling of Sector 7. It was meant only for small maintenance drones, but it represented an unbroken, unmonitored path deep into the ship's forgotten belly, and potentially to the external docking clamps. He wouldn't survive the crawl. His broken arm would fail completely. The movement would drain the last of his strength, and the air quality in Zone 0 was likely toxic. It was a statistical impossibility of survival. But Nolan wasn't looking for survival. He was looking for operational utility. He needed to escape the Orion before the TSDI fleet, the fleet he had just thrown into chaos, could restore order and turn its eye to its own internal traitors. He had nothing to lose but his exhaustion. Nolan gripped the edge of the fractured bulkhead with his right hand, his muscles screaming under the strain. He used his good shoulder to ram himself through the jagged opening. The polysteel tore through the fabric of his suit, slicing a deep, burning gouge across his flank. He fell through the opening, landing hard on the icy floor of the abandoned Sector 7 crew quarters. The air here was even colder. thick with a fine granular dust of centuries-old biocontainment powder. He smelled synthetic decay and silence. He looked up. There it was, the emergency access duct, a rectangular seam 15 feet above the floor. There was no ladder, only exposed conduit bundles. Nolan gritted his teeth, the pain in his arm a raw, electric pulse. He had to climb. He had to leverage his one good limb and the rigidity of his broken one to haul his 80 kilograms of exhausted mass upward. He forced himself onto the first set of conduits, using the small structural support struts as footholds. His right arm was shaking violently, failing under the combined fatigue and cold. You should stop, West. You failed. Let the system process the mess you created. He reached the 7th strut, inches from the duct entrance. He could feel the cold of the metal searing through his gloves. He needed one final pull. Just as he locked his fingers onto the access panel, a heavy, rhythmic thudding echoed from the data maintenance sector he had just left. The sound was unmistakable. The heavy magnetic boots of the Orion's internal security detail. They had found the breach. A synthesized voice, amplified and chillingly precise, boomed through the abandoned sector's comm system, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Sector 7, Nolan West, cease all movement. You are identified as a perpetrator of an unauthorized information transfer resulting in strategic failure. Immediate surrender is mandated. Failure to comply will result in a lethal kinetic response. The voice was Merrin Frost's. She was on board or coordinating the hunt. The dreadnought's paranoia was now focused entirely on him. Nolan did not stop. He pulled with the last ounce of strength, scraping his splintered arm against the metal seam. The pain was irrelevant. He didn't care about the lethal kinetic response. He only cared about not dying quietly in the dark. He managed to rip the panel open, revealing the small, pitch-black maw of the maintenance duct. He shoved his broken arm first, twisting his body violently to slide inside. He was in, trapped in a narrow metal coffin, suffocating in cold dust. Below him, the heavy, metallic screech of the security team prying open the fractured bulkhead door resonated through the duct. Nolan began to crawl, the rough edges of the duct tearing at his suit, propelled not by hope, but by the ugly refusal to surrender. He was crawling deep into the belly of the beast he had betrayed, armed only with a shattered limb and a stubborn hatred for systemic lies. He was loud, broken, and running on borrowed time, knowing that every inch he gained was only extending the moment of his inevitable end. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The duct was a tomb tailored to his dimensions, 150 meters of narrow, abrasive darkness smelling of ancient containment powder and fried circuitry. Nolan crawled, his broken left arm held stiffly ahead, scraping against the rough steel and transmitting jolts of blinding pain every time his body snagged on an access port cover. He was moving on sheer adrenaline and an engineer's cold fury. Below him, the magnetic thud-thud-thud of the security team's approach grew louder. Merrin Frost's voice had faded, but the implicit promise of lethal kinetics remained. They knew he was in Sector 7. They were calculating trajectory and speed. They were treating him like debris to be purged. Nolan reached a junction. He paused, pressing his cheek against the cold duct floor. The structural schematics, burned into his memory since his induction training, provided the only light. Ahead, a heavy maintenance barrier, Protocol Gate Delta 3, was descending, sealing the duct. System reaction. Merrin Frost was locking down the internal conduits. This wasn't a standard security protocol. This was an executive order, prioritizing his capture over ease of access for the eventual repair crews. He checked his multi-tool. Its basic plasma cutter was insufficient to slice through the high-density plating of the gate, and the encryption counter was already cycling too fast for manual override. The TSDI had learned from the core breach incident. They were not relying on standard network security. But this duct was 2 centuries old. It was pre-Federation architecture, designed by engineers who trusted physical redundancy more than code. Nolan reached down, finding a loose inspection plate 3 feet from the gate. He ripped it free with his good hand, grunting at the effort. Inside, a tangled knot of cables, power conduits for the gate mechanism itself, routed directly from Emergency Substation Delta 7. This substation ran on an autonomous, non-networked relay that utilized archaic, manual fail-safe protocols. He needed a short circuit, a violent spike of uncontrolled energy to trip the thermal shunt and force the gate into its default open for diagnostic mode. He fumbled in his utility pouch, locating the heavy, insulated coil of industrial-grade copper wire he carried for emergency field splicing, a habit from his days on the logistical hull plating crew. He stripped the insulation with his teeth, the copper tasting like raw voltage and desperation. The security team was directly beneath him now, the sound of their heavily armored boots vibrating through the conduit bundles, almost deafening. West. Stop immediately. We have locked all forward sectors. You have nowhere to go but out, and we control the vacuum seal. Merrin Frost's voice crackled, this time routed directly into the duct's microspeakers, cold and precise. Nolan ignored her, focusing on the 3 primary power lines. He jammed the copper wire across the 3 positive leads, creating an instantaneous, chaotic connection. The result was not silent efficiency. A blinding, roaring electrical storm erupted from the access panel. Blue-white plasma arced violently, vaporizing the surrounding insulation. The heat was immediate, overwhelming, searing the exposed skin on his face and the back of his right hand. The noise inside the duct was horrific. 100-decibel shriek of tortured current that felt like sandpaper tearing through his brain. The blast was localized but powerful enough to surge through the duct system. The ancient power relay cried out under the duress, and with a sickening, grinding thunk, the hydraulic seal on Protocol Gate Delta 3 failed. The heavy barrier retracted with a shriek of tortured metal, dragging itself into the ceiling recess. Nolan shielded his face, the smell of burning synthetic polymer filling his lungs. He was half-blinded, his right hand blistered, but the path was clear. Below, the security team responded instantly. He overloaded the Delta 7 junction. Secondary environmental lockdown initiated. Divert all atmosphere from Sector 7 to prevent thermal propagation. Frost commanded. A sudden sharp drop in pressure sucked the contaminated air past Nolan, down the length of the duct. The temperature plummeted again, the humidity freezing into glittering, choking dust motes. Nolan was now crawling in a vacuum in progress, racing against the clock of atmospheric decay. He pushed himself through the now open gate into the next section of the duct. a vertical shaft leading toward the exterior hull plating of Sector 5. He reached the base of the shaft, pulling his exhausted body onto the maintenance platform. He didn't rest. He immediately located the external clamp controls, a bulky, heavily shielded control box for the emergency retrieval shuttle, designated Vapor 9. The Vapor 9 was one of the 3 primary evacuation vessels used for crew extraction during a catastrophic hull breach. Its controls were housed here, deep within the ship's structure, because its launch trajectory had to bypass hundreds of meters of dreadnought superstructure. He jammed his multi-tool into the obsolete port, bypassing the digital interface entirely and searching for the physical locking pins. He needed to manually cycle the clamp release, while simultaneously overriding the atmospheric seal control. As he worked feverishly, ignoring the throbbing pain that radiated from his arm and his newly burned hand, the Orion's internal defense systems finally retaliated. A low, mechanical whine preceded the attack. 3 maintenance drones, small, heavily armored, spider-like constructs armed with plasma welders and kinetic restraints, dropped silently from a nearby access hatch. They were not designed for killing, but for neutralizing mechanical threats. In the TSDI playbook, Nolan West was now a mechanical threat. The lead drone fired a restraint net, a high-tensile carbon filament mesh. Nolan ducked under the humming projectile, the net striking the hull plating where his head had been, and immediately fusing itself to the metal with a burst of heat. He swung his splintered arm violently, striking the second drone as it scuttled across the floor. The impact was minimal, but it bought him a fraction of a second. He yanked the multi-tool free, having successfully located the manual release for the primary lock. He now held the fate of the Vapor 9 in his hand. If he released the shuttle, the sudden shift in mass could destabilize the Orion's already compromised maneuverability in the immediate aftermath of the Scarveth assault. But if he didn't, he died. The third drone rushed him, its plasma torch already heating to a dangerous yellow-white point. "Prioritize mass integrity," Nolan muttered, reciting the old doctrine Varys had taught him. He didn't prioritize the Orion's integrity. He prioritized his own. He slammed the multi-tool down onto the manual release switch. K-Rak Thum. The sound was immense. 36 heavy magnetic clamps, each designed to hold the small shuttle fast against G-forces equivalent to stellar collapse, released simultaneously. The kinetic shockwave blasted through the maintenance shaft, throwing Nolan hard against the wall. He tasted copper and dust. The third drone, caught in the rapid expansion of the newly opened external seal, was violently crushed against the internal bulkheads, its plasma torch sparking uselessly. Nolan scrambled to his feet. The external docking port was visible now, a gaping maw leading directly to the inky void, marked by the receding stern of the Vapor 9. He launched himself across the narrow gap, relying on the brief, agonizing moment of negative G created by the rapid pressure equalization. He collided hard with the shuttle's open ramp, his broken arm screaming a protest that was instantly muffled by the roar of the exterior environment. He scrambled into the cockpit. The vessel was already cycling its pre-flight checks, running on an automated launch sequence. "Commander Frost to West, you are hijacking a military asset. If you do not disengage the launch sequence, we will be forced to incinerate the shuttle." Merrin Frost's voice returned, this time with a hard, unwavering edge of absolute authority. Nolan slammed his fist down on the manual override for the cockpit environmental seal, activating the internal atmosphere. He ignored the tactical display flashing lethal kinetic lock warnings. They couldn't fire on the Vapor 9 without risking a catastrophic detonation that would compromise the Orion's hull in this sector. She was bluffing, relying on his exhaustion. He wrestled the controls, overriding the automated trajectory. The shuttle shuddered violently, then blasted free of the dreadnought's protective shadow, lurching away from the massive ship. He had escaped. He was free of the TSDI's institutional grip. Nolan slumped into the pilot's seat, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His victory was the brief sensation of survival, a visceral rush that lasted less than 10 seconds. Then the tactical display flickered from red to deep, terrifying amber. He looked out the reinforced viewport. The Vapor 9 was not a heavy shuttle. It was a lifeboat designed for short-range transit. Ahead, 300 meters away, floated the Orion's main external cargo bay doors, the section housing the long-range data archive. This was where the evidence of the Scarveth strategic data, the data he had saved by sacrificing Vega, was still housed. Just as he wrenched the control stick to turn the Vapor 9 towards the archive bay, a high-velocity, small-caliber kinetic round struck the shuttle's starboard engine housing. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a precise, targeted execution. Merrin Frost hadn't been bluffing about incineration. She hadn't fired on the primary hull, but she had authorized the immediate destruction of the escape vessel. After it cleared the blast radius of the Orion's main structure, TSDI doctrine: eliminate the threat, minimize collateral damage to the asset. The shuttle screamed. The starboard engine exploded in a silent, dazzling spray of white-hot debris, venting atmosphere and plasma. The Vapor 9 tumbled violently, spinning out of control in the void, throwing Nolan hard against his restraints. The display flashed a definitive message. Hull breach. System failure. Loss of propulsion. Nolan fought the sickening spin, his vision blurring. His head struck the console, and a fresh wave of pain brought nausea. The control stick was useless. The flight systems were dead. He was adrift, paralyzed, inside a rapidly decaying metal shell. He had neutralized the threat of the TSDI internal security, only to be crippled by their institutional commitment to punitive measures. The spinning slowed, leaving him oriented toward the vast, silent bulk of the Sword of Orion. The view was devastating. The massive dreadnought, a kilometre-long testament to human over-engineering, was not just wounded from the Scarveth assault, it was mauled. Gigantic half-melted sections of kinetic armour plating hung loose like torn skin. The dreadnought's portside defence batteries were slagged, fused into useless metal. Near the central command tower, an entire section of life support tubing was violently venting, freezing the void with glistening white particles. The Orion was a wreck, a broken Leviathan floating in the black. The battle was over, but the cost was astronomical. The TSDI had driven off the initial Scarveth probe, but the fleet was scattered, damaged, and crippled. And then Nolan saw what truly mattered, what dwarfed the systemic mess he had just barely survived. Above and beyond the crippled dreadnought, moving in slow, silent formation, a logistical impossibility, was the enemy's main force, Hundreds of angular light-absorbing Scarveth vessels were emerging from the dark smear of the veil, their intent no longer tactical, but comprehensive. They were not probes, they were the main wave. Nolan's escape had cost him his ability to communicate the critical data, and it had cost the TSDI precious time. He was free, but entirely useless. A broken engineer in a broken shuttle, staring at the impending civilizational collapse. He tried to raise the comms, a pathetic, ragged cough escaping his lips. Nothing. The antenna was severed. He looked down at his multi-tool, now scarred and blackened from the electrical short, resting uselessly on his lap. He had traded a massive political problem for a massive existential one. The Scarveth fleet advanced, their hulls swallowing the ambient light. They were coming for the wounded Orion. They were coming for the Terran sector. Nolan closed his eyes, his consciousness fading into the deep, exhaustion-driven darkness. He was just loud enough to save his life, but entirely too small to stop the systems, both human and alien, that were about to devour everything. The air recycler within the crippled Vapor 9 had long since failed its primary filtration cycle. Nolan West drifted in a suspended state of triage, strapped tightly into the pilot's harness. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the low, erratic hiss of the secondary sealant gel, attempting to maintain pressure against the jagged hole in the starboard bulkhead. He had been unconscious for 5 hours, standard reckoning. When his eyes finally flickered open, the pain, a dense, vibrating throb centered in his left clavicle and radiating down his blistered right arm, was no longer a searing siren, but a dull, insistent anchor, pulling him back to physical reality. The viewport still offered the tableau of disaster. The sword of Orion was a dark, wounded presence holding its position, seemingly abandoned. The Scarveth fleet, however, had moved. They were not attacking the dreadnought yet. They were encircling it, patient and absolute, maintaining a perimeter 20,000 kilometers out. A silent, vast tactical statement. It was the movement of hunters who knew their prey was trapped and dying slowly. He tried the comms again. Nothing, just the white noise of a severed umbilical. A flash of light. Not hostile fire, but a precision docking beacon. A small TSDI recovery cutter, barely larger than a heavy fighter, approached the disabled shuttle. It didn't broadcast a challenge or a rescue hail. It simply locked onto the Vapor 9's stern, coupling with a clean mechanical clank. This was not salvation. This was recovery of a valuable piece of scrap, and the liability contained within it. 2 hours later, Nolan was no longer adrift in the vacuum. He was secured in a medical isolation bay aboard the TSDI fleet repair ship, the Mendicant. He was washed, stabilized, and subjected to low-level neural scans. No one spoke to him. There were no auditors, no tribunals, and certainly no congratulations. The repair ship was designed for long-duration field service. Its atmosphere was thick, humid, and heavy with the smell of ozone and disinfectant, a clinical inverse of the metallic grit he was accustomed to. A single, laminated data slate was clipped to the foot of his bed. He lifted his good hand, the burned skin protesting the movement, and pulled the slate closer. The first document was a formal notice of apprehension. It listed 5 separate violations: felony theft of military asset, Vapor 9, sabotage of strategic infrastructure, Gate Delta 3, assault on autonomous security units, and finally, insurrection. The second document was an administrative addendum, brief and brutal. Subject: West Nolan. Status: detained. Indictment: pending judicial review. Note on strategic data retrieval. The data archive. West attempted to access prior to the destruction of the Vapor 9 was determined to be redundant. The Scarveth strategic telemetry was successfully secured by Commander Frost's team during the initial crisis phase. West's actions, therefore, contributed zero net gain to the TSDI war effort. Conclusion. The subject is responsible for the complete loss of the Vapor 9 shuttle, estimated value 700 million credits, and the extensive damage to the Sword of Orion's internal infrastructure. Nolan let the slate drop onto the synthetic blanket. The bureaucracy had absorbed his sacrifice and redefined it as failure. He had traded 3 million credits of Ethan Moss liability for 700 million credits of government hardware liability. The institutional system was perfect in its inefficiency. It had wasted a key man, crippled a key asset, and yet the paperwork was immaculate. The data he had nearly died to secure had already been duplicated and seized by the very security chief who had just tried to kill him. He turned his head slowly, looking at the smooth, polished white wall of the isolation bay. The only sound was the low, pervasive thrum of the Mendicant's auxiliary fusion reactor, a controlled burn, a focused beam of kinetic resonance. It was the sound that had begun this entire nightmare, the ceaseless infrastructural heartbeat of human resilience and human arrogance. Merrin Frost entered the bay, flanked by 2 silent, heavily armed guards. She wasn't wearing combat armor, but the crisp, starched grey uniform of a TSDI executive officer. She looked tired, her eyes deeply shadowed, but her posture was unwavering. She did not sit. She stood at the end of the bed, observing him as if he were a failed experiment. "You survived, West," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "That is an engineering feat in itself. I gave the order to disable the shuttle, not destroy it outright. Your failure to prioritize the structural integrity of the Orion cost us 500 million credits and complicated the post-assault recovery." Nolan swallowed, his throat dry. "The Scarveth fleet is here, Commander. Hundreds of ships. The data I salvaged confirms a coordinated attack, not a probe. Are you still worried about the shuttle?" "I am worried about the chain of command," Frost corrected him, her eyes cold. "We are Deathworlders, West. We build solutions that last forever, and we build systems of control that last longer. The Scarveth threat is external. The failure to maintain internal discipline is existential. We cannot fight them if we are fighting ourselves." She paused, allowing the weight of the logic to settle. "The tribunal review for your original charges was cancelled the moment the Scarveth arrived. Now you have new charges. You are a valuable engineer, but a liability to the system. The TSDI has decided to utilize your expertise for the next phase of the conflict." Nolan felt a flicker of hope, immediately suppressed. He knew the cost of this utilization. "My status?" he asked, his voice rough. "You are no longer Engineer Nolan West. Your official record is redacted, categorized as KIA, killed in action, during the Scarveth initial assault. Your debts are wiped. Your identity is terminated. You are now designated Logistics Asset 407. You will be assigned to Deep Space Logistics, operating non-networked systems on remote stations within the Veil." He was being exiled, reduced to a nameless cog, forever operating in the shadows, fixing problems too ugly for the TSDI to acknowledge publicly, barred from the human society he had fought to save. His punishment was eternal, anonymous labour. You will never speak of the Sword of Orion, of Synthara, or of Commander Varys's decisions. Frost continued, You will not speak of the Scarveth advance warning. You are a ghost, West. An efficient piece of hardware we can finally deploy without worrying about political oversight or ethical committees. She walked toward the door, her movement precise and institutional. I hope the silence suits you, 407. It's the closest thing to peace you will ever earn. Nolan watched the door hiss shut behind her. The guards remained outside. He reached up, touching the raw, burned skin on his right hand, the mark of the high-voltage short he had used to escape the duct. He lowered his hand slowly, clenching his jaw against the pervasive taste of the recycled air. The taste that was the same as it had been 20 days ago, just colder now. The cloying metallic grit of plasma residue and superheated grease, trapped forever in the recycled air of the new war. The silent, ongoing cost of being human. He had prioritized 40,000 lives over culture, and his own life over the system's order. The result was not victory or defeat, but irrelevance. Survival at all costs. Was always followed by the bill. He closed his eyes, sinking back into the pillow. The debt was wiped, but the price was paid in full. The endless grinding vibration of the reactor beneath him promised a future of unacknowledged labour and perpetual dread. The human system was robust, certainly. It managed crises, maintained control, and ensured its own persistence, even if it had to consume its best components to do so. The Scarveth might shatter the physical fleet, but the corrosive, self-serving logic of the bureaucracy would continue to hum, efficient and indifferent, long after the stars went out. He breathed deeply, tasting the coppery residue of exhaustion and sacrifice. He was prepared to be loud, they had asked. Now they demanded he be silent. The quiet had finally come, and it was a form of permanent imprisonment. Far worse than the noise of war. The universe is vast and indifferent. But the administrative costs, they are eternal. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science